Today we have one of those gospel passages that causes Christians just a little bit of trouble. Not because it's a difficult passage, not because it leaves us scratching our heads trying to figure out just what Jesus was trying to do, but because it puts us in a position of looking in at another religious tradition, judging it, and perhaps realizing that our judgment isn't correct. We find today the story of Jesus, who is in the synagogue preaching. Jesus, as he traveled around, would regularly stop in at the local synagogue. And it was customary to have the traveling rabbi get a chance to speak. I remember years ago when I was working up in Ohio, I was newly ordained, and I visited a church that was having a revival service. And I was sitting there in the pew just like you are, and the service progressed and it got around to the time of the sermon, and the preacher of the night saw me sitting there, and he said, "And we have a guest with us, and Paul, I'd like to invite you to come up and deliver the sermon." Did I mention that I was newly ordained? I had about 4 sermons that I had preached at that point. Fortunately, one of them had been that very morning. And so the sermon that I preached in the morning became the sermon that I preached that evening. By the way, do we have anyone who would like to come up and give the sermon today? I'm not seeing anybody. Okay, I just want to give you that opportunity. Well, Jesus was given that opportunity, and he took it. There he was in the synagogue preaching, and he looked out and he happened to see a woman sitting in the back pew, as it were, except she was actually standing, because the way that the ancient synagogues did things is exactly the opposite of how we do. The preacher would be sitting, and everyone else would be standing around. So he looked out and he saw this woman standing there, an older woman who had a curvature to her spine. She'd been that way for years. She couldn't look up. Yet she came every Sabbath to be part of the worshiping community. She, as a child of Abraham and Sarah, knew what it meant to be part of a community of faith. And that congregation loved her. We know that from what the Gospel of Luke tells us. Jesus looked out and saw her there. And he called her forward and he laid his hand on her back. And this woman who'd been hunched over for 18 years stood straight and tall. And that's where the story should probably end, with Jesus healing this woman from a condition that had caused her problems for the better part of 2 decades. But of course, it's Luke's gospel. And Luke starts filling in details at this point about how the president of the synagogue complained. Now, the president of our congregation, our moderator, Laura, if we were to have somebody be healed in the middle of the service, I just wanted to clear this up with you. Would you complain about that? Would you say, "Oh no, you can't go doing that on Sunday"? No. You're sure? Positive? Okay. You pass. But the president of that synagogue did complain. There are 6 days in the week, Jesus, when you could have healed this woman. Yet you're healing her on the Sabbath. And that's a no-no. And I stop and I think to myself, have we Christians misread this story? These religious leaders, these Pharisees who knew the law, are so often caricatured. They're put up as the straw man against whom we argue. Those are the baddies. Those are the people who were all twisted up in religion instead of spirituality. But the reality is that the president of that synagogue, just like Laura, nothing personal, was concerned with the things that we do together that ensure good worship. The president of that synagogue wanted the good order of the community to go forward. And I have to tell you that if someone were to come up in the middle of my sermon and ask to be healed, I would, well, first off, I probably would say I can't do that. But even if I could, there might be a part of me that said, can't you wait till the sermon's over? No, the president of that synagogue was trying to just keep things in decent order. You don't interrupt stuff for something you can do at a normal time. But Jesus was never one for order. Jesus was never one who said, we worship at 9:30 and it goes exactly 1 hour, and no. When the Spirit moved, Jesus moved. And so Jesus healed that woman in the middle of the synagogue service because it was the right thing to do. It was the right time to do it because that's when he was there. So often we think about how things work, how we time things. The hospital where I work only has about 2% of our patients who are Jewish. But some of the hospitals down in the city, which have much larger Jewish populations, will have a Shabbat room, where the Jews who come in who have needs for Sabbath quiet can find it. They have Shabbos elevators that automatically just go up and down from floor to floor so that the Jewish patients and their families can get on and take a ride without violating the rules for Sabbath with pushing the buttons. To us Christians, those seem like strange requirements. But for our Jewish siblings, it's important to follow the law, to follow the rules of faith. We Christians don't do rules so very much. But there's a group called Hatzalah, which is the Jewish Rescue Squad. And if you go into the city, you may see some of their ambulances with the Hebrew lettering on them. And it's a group that is designed to provide medical care for Jewish patients who are concerned with following the religious rules. And you know what happens on the Sabbath? When Jews are supposed to be resting and reflecting, if Hatzalah gets a call for emergency, anybody want to guess what happens? Yeah, they show up. They roll up in their cars, they roll up with an ambulance, they get people down the stairs in a gurney, they take them to the hospital. Because the Hebrew Scriptures clearly teach that saving a life, that doing good, it outvalues just keeping the rules. In fact, breaking the rule is the rule. We Christians, though, sometimes we get caught up with timing. Even in our way of doing things, we say it's not the right time. Dr. Martin Luther King famously wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail that justice delayed is justice denied. He, of course, didn't make up that phrase. He was quoting from the Mishnah, the ancient Jewish teachings, a teaching that was echoed in the Magna Carta. Justice delayed is justice denied. And in that same letter, he wrote about how the real enemy of freedom wasn't the Ku Klux Klansman or the white citizens' counselor, but instead the white moderate, who said, "Not now." We have a way of deferring justice as people. And that's true whether we look at ourselves as Americans or as Christians or as just plain old people. It's so much easier to say, later. Things are okay for us now. We'll get to your problem eventually. This week, we as a nation have marked the 400th anniversary of the first arrival of Africans in an English-speaking colony in the New World. And you have to phrase it that way, because the history of European expansion into the Americas is a history of genocide and of slavery. Christopher Columbus enslaved people. Throughout the Caribbean, native people were enslaved. African people were brought in to work sugar plantations. There was already slavery going on in the New World in 1619. But we mark 1619, August 20th, as a date that the White Lion, a privateer, arrived in Jamestown, coming in at Point Comfort, with 20-some-odd Africans on board, and sold them into slavery. Telling the story from 1619 is, in its own way, a sign of our own blinkers when we ignore the slavery that went before. But it's still a marker. It's a pin we can put in the map, as it was the Jamestown colony that eventually became Virginia, that eventually became part of the United States through our Anglo-centric American view. Those 20-some-odd Africans, 400 years ago this week, sold into slavery. It's a number we hear. The other number is 12 million. Africans captured and placed on ships, brought across to the New World. Not just the United States, no. 12 million, though, ripped from their homes in West Africa. 4 million dying on the passage across. 8 million being enslaved in North and South America and the Caribbean, building our nation and the nations in our hemisphere. Building the White House with black hands. Our church and our ancestor churches spoke to this. Congregationalists here in New England were among the very first abolitionist voices. In 1839, it was Congregationalists who got together to defend the Amistad captives. In 1860, it was Congregationalists among many others who in blue uniforms marched south. And after the war, it was our church folk who went as teachers and administrators of what would become the historically black colleges and universities, Dillard, Fisk, Houston Tillotson, Tougaloo, Lemoyne-Owen, and Talladega, started by our church. It was in 1987 that our United Church of Christ pioneered a study, Toxic Wastes and Race, and coined the term environmental racism. Yeah, that's us. We've always been pushing against racism. We always strive to have sacred conversations on race. And there's a lot more work to be done. Because we don't just look back to days of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining. We look at issues of race and racism today. We see police brutality. We see a criminal justice system that is not equitable. We see purging of voter rolls. We see systems of racism that are deeply embedded, and we work against those. Today, we pause and we reflect on 400 years of racism in what would become and what now is the United States. Today, at 3 o'clock, take a listen, wherever you are. Open your ears, you may hear some bells ringing. The National Park Service has requested anybody with a bell to ring it for 4 minutes at 3 o'clock. 4 minutes, it's a blink of an eye in comparison with 400 years. But we remember those 20-odd Africans who were brought in chains to Point Comfort. We remember the legacy of slavery, of injustice. And we remember the continued call to work for justice for all people. We'll be ringing our bell. Maybe you'll be here for that. If so, excellent. But wherever you are, pause. Take a listen. Hear the bells of remembrance and the bells of freedom. That's what our faith calls us to celebrate. The gift of freedom, the work of freedom, the work of justice. The psalmist, when writing the psalm that we read earlier, no doubt had similar ideas of freedom and hope. In you, O God, I take refuge. Never let me be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me and rescue me. Incline your ear and save me. Be to me a rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. Rescue me, O God, from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of the unjust and cruel. For you, O God, are my hope, my trust, O God, from my youth. Upon you I have leaned from my birth. It was you who took me from my mother's womb. My praise is continually of you. Let us then in our lives sing that praise, the praise of justice and liberation for our African American siblings, for our nation, as together we work to end all oppression. May it be so. Amen.